All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show OJ Oleka, CEO of the State Financial Officers Foundation. Welcome to Free the Economy, OJ.
Richard, it's good to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you and your listeners.
All right, fantastic. Now, to start, just in case there are one or two people out there who are not already familiar, can you give us the quick elevator pitch for the State Financial Officers Foundation and what your mission is?
Absolutely. The State Financial Officers Foundation is an organization that exists to promote sound, fiscally responsible policies, particularly in partnership with our key stakeholders to educate the American people on the importance of financial management in a free market economy. And a financial officer is effectively a statewide elected or appointed financial officer that matches those free market values, that matches the belief in the rule of law, accountability, civil discourse, free speech, and again, sound fiscal policy and financial management. So our folks are some 40 strong across 29 states who, by virtue of their sole fiduciary responsibility or the boards that they sit on, represent roughly $3 trillion of assets under management. So these folks are strong. These folks believe in free markets. They believe in liberty and free enterprise. And the State Financial Officers Foundation works every day to provide them the resources they need to work on behalf of their constituents across the country.
All right, fantastic. So, there's a lot changing here in DC, at least recently. So we've got a new, or I guess returning president. We got new majorities in Congress, and you know, for some people that might seem like, oh well, that's just something for people at the national level to be worried about. I'm just here in South Dakota or Utah or Idaho. But obviously, there's a lot of interaction, right, between the federal and state government functions, between federal tax dollars and state budgets and all that kind of stuff. So, how does for your members, people who are the state treasurers and auditors and those folks, how does this new kind of leadership in DC affect those guys in those states?
Well, we are thankful that it can affect our folks in an extremely positive way. You mentioned South Dakota, Idaho, Utah in particular. Those are three states where we've got financial officers. And what we have found, and everyone has been, I think, a part of this conversation who's listening to this, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, this idea that shockingly, government should be doing things efficiently with less money and in a constitutional fashion. Our financial officers were doing DOGE before it was cool, as a number of them have said, whether they're treasurers or auditors or comptrollers, this is their very function at a state level. So when it comes to making sure that departments of education are spending money on actually educating kids, that's what our financial officers have done and continue to do. If it's rooting out waste and fraud and abuse at the state level, our financial officers have been doing that for years. So the benefit that we've got in DC now is that we have a president and we have a Congress that is oriented the same way. How can we make government efficient? How can we make it constitutional? And how can we make it actually accountable to the people in terms of how money is spent? We've already had good conversations with then the Trump transition team, but the Trump administration now, and how we can play a part in that. So DOGE is going to be huge, but also you've already started to see the president act in a pretty big way on issues that are really important to our state financial officers, like ESG and DEI. If you can root out ESG from investing and DEI from spending, certainly actions and activity, but obviously the cost of that labor, of those policies, of those programs out of government at the federal level and at the state level, you can save a ton of money and you can bring in a new age that focus on meritocracy. So those are a couple ways that we are working with the Trump administration that we're excited about what President Trump and the Congress is going to be doing here in the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, yeah, so that leads into the very next thing I want to talk about, which is one of the big topics we've been looking about, again in finance and finance regulation is ESG, what we call environmental, social, and governance investing, generally sort of left-wing investing, for lack of a better term, prioritizing a lot of like progressive policy goals. Uh, so you've got, investments and funds operated by private actor, private financial firms out there that will, prioritize things like climate change or, DEI diversity goals instead of just financial return. And I think a lot of people who have been part of this debate for the past few years have said the same thing, which is I'm all for people putting their own money in whatever financial product they choose to, even if I think it might be a foolish choice. But it's obviously another question when someone is managing someone else's money. And
Yes,
that often happens in the case of, say, like a state pension fund, right?
that's right.
You got people who are either, elected or appointed or some mix, deciding for millions of other people where their money is going to go, and they don't necessarily have that direct input into it the way you would like with a self-directed IRA or something. So,
Right.
how have your members approached this when it comes to, again, something like state pensions, where it's really someone else's money? It's those retired firefighters and police officers and teachers, but it's people like your members and people who work with them and for them who are managing that.
Yeah, our members and financial officers have focused on this pretty judiciously and with a focus on fiduciary duty. Now, again, you've got brilliant listeners and folks who pay attention to this show. To the folks who might be new coming on, just to kind of break down some of these words. So, when we say fiduciary duty, it is the expectation that you, somebody who governs, who invests, who is responsible, as you pointed out, Richard, for someone else's money, you do so focusing on, and here's another big word, a pecuniary interest or pecuniary factors. That just means that you spend your time making sure that that fund, that someone else's money, has a financial benefit to it when you invest it. And so the idea is that ESG investing, again, environmental social governance, environmental, which focuses on climate action, climate activity, interest and focus there. Social is more of the DEI, focusing on the equity piece of whatever the worldview is. And then, of course, governance, the proxy votes, and the shareholder proposals attached to that. ESG investing says, instead of focusing on financial benefits, I'm going to focus on something else in tandem with financial benefits or something else entirely. So that means, again, if I care about climate change or climate action, I'm a big believer in that sort of thing. Or if I care about DEI and equity and that sort of thing, I'm going to invest in funds, in businesses that also care about that. It doesn't matter if they're successful. Doesn't matter if it would be provide a financial benefit. I'm going to invest in that. And so what you've seen from court cases and what our financial officers have said is that's wrong. You need to focus on fiduciary duty, on the best possible financial returns only. Full stop. You just saw this come out of a case in a district court in Texas. There was a judge that ruled on this, the American Airlines case, that
Hmm.
said American Airlines violated their duty to loyalty with this same idea. They didn't focus in their pension plan. Again, these are private actors. They didn't focus their pension plan explicitly on financial benefits. They used BlackRock, which, by their own admission, focuses on ESG investing. So our folks at the state level are fighting against this all across the country. They have said in a number of states, Texas is one of them, Kentucky is another, Oklahoma, Florida, and some others. They say, look, if you're focusing on something other than pecuniary returns, if you're focused on something other than financial benefits, we just may make the decision not to do business with you at all. They've got their lists. Those responsibilities have passed legislatures. They are now statute and law of the land, and our folks are approaching it from that perspective.
Well, yeah, as you point out, state officials have a responsibility to their pension fund fiduciaries, or their pension fund beneficiaries, like we said, those retired firefighters, police officers, teachers. Um, and that's pretty straightforward. You can go back hundreds of years in sort of English common law tradition, American law. If you're someone who's administering a trust, you have a basic implied, even if it's not explicitly spelled out in a specific law, you have that responsibility that you are administering that on behalf of someone else. But then, as you said, even with this American Airlines case recently, even though that's a private pension fund, even those are regulated in the United States under this
Arista.
law from 1974 called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, that was passed specifically because there were both union and corporate pension funds in the 1960s that went bust and left their retirees with no money. So Congress said, okay, well, we're going to have these regulations. So both both the government ones and the private ones, there are legal expectations that those people who are managing them have to prioritize that financial return. So it's
Right.
not just, I think occasionally the discussion of this gets a little loose, saying like, well, you could invest in A or you could invest in B. It's sort of like up in the air about whether one is better than the other. So it's just kind of up to the judgment of whoever the like investment manager is. Like, well, no, it's not really,
That's
right?
right.
Either you're investing to make the most amount of money for your beneficiaries or you're not. And the whole point of ESG is that they're explicitly saying we're not trying to make the most money.
That's right. And it's important, I think, to give folks a clear example here. So basically, what would consider to be ESG investing is if in front of you as an asset manager, you have two different opportunities for investment. One is a company that makes widgets, and they say, our focus is to make widgets. We want to be the best widget maker in the world. That is what our charter is. That is what our shareholders want. We want to be the best possible widget maker ever. And then you've got company B that says, we also make widgets. But at the same time, we are going to make sure that when we make widgets, we do so with sustainability. We are going to make widgets using green energy. And also on our board, we're going to make sure that we have quotas for Black people, for brown people, for women, and so on. That effectively is incorporating E, the environmental aspect. Again, they are telling people they want to use green energy. They want to use something that is effectively more expensive to make their widgets. And also, they are, quote, diversifying their board by putting different people on it. Again, regardless of ability, regardless of merit, they're just making the statement. We are focusing on, again, this is the S or diversity, equity, inclusion, the DEI portion of what ESG is. So if as an asset manager, you say, I want to focus on the widget company that's going to do ESG and DEI, as opposed to the other company, simply because I like the fact that they're focusing on these things, that's where you have potential violations and potential issues under the law. If you just looked at either one and said, look, company A or company B performs better, then I'm going to go with that company because I have a fiduciary duty. I have a responsibility to make sure that the returns for my fund are the highest. That's the difference. To your point, it doesn't matter if there is some legal issue or legal focus that a company has in their corporate interest. If the focus that you're trying to push as an asset manager is related to those politics and a leftist perspective in particular, that's where you're going to run into trouble. And that's what our financial officers are trying to push back against.
hmm and I feel like one of the problems here with states where they, again, this is focusing for a second on sort of like the state-run pension plans and
Mhm.
state governments directing investments. I feel like one of the problems with states where they have explicitly embraced sort of ESG style investments, like California, Illinois, and New York, three really big ones. There's sort of two problems here. So if those pensions underperform because they're prioritizing politics rather than financial return, those states' taxpayers could likely be on the hook for some sort of bailout in the future.
Yep.
Um, but with the very biggest states, again, like those ones I just mentioned, like California, New York, a default, a really significant systemic default could be so big that I feel like the state wouldn't be able to cope with it.
Mhm.
And that would mean that they would eventually, their only option would be to come to Congress and get a national taxpayer bailout, federal level bailout. Um, and some of our more mature listeners may remember back in the 1970s when New York City was facing a um, uh, sort of municipal bankruptcy, and the city was in a really terrible position. And the mayor at the time wanted federal bailout. And there's a famous New York Post headline when President Ford refused to entertain that idea. And the headline was "Ford to New York, drop dead." Right. Um, so it wouldn't be the first time that a state or a big city had contemplated the idea that like Congress is going to bail them out for their bad financial decisions just because, well, you wouldn't want our whole city or state to go bankrupt, would you? That would look terrible, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so what do you think the chances are in the next say 5 to 10 years where we see a big blue state pension begin to have real problems because of this? Because different states have sort of emphasized this more to some extremes than others.
Mhm.
Again, New York, Illinois, and California seem really out there and saying, yes, yes, we want ESG themed investments, even for something that you would normally be conservative with, like retired state teachers pension funds.
Right. Look, I hope it's really low because, as you mentioned, these are real people's lives. I mean, I tell folks all the time, again, we look at this oftentimes from the perspective of policy or from a national debate about climate or about diversity, equity, inclusion. But these are real people's lives. These are members of law enforcement who put their lives on the line every day, who are retired and now are hoping to get what they've earned, and their beneficiaries, their loved ones, their spouses are hoping to get what was earned. These are teachers. These are people who educate our kids, who spend a lot of time, their professional career, ensuring that our children are able to be as creative as God made them, are able to fulfill their professional pursuits the way that they want to. These are folks who believe in the American dream. These are people who work and push it and protect it every single day. I shudder to think what would happen if one of these pensions failed. My family benefits from this. My parents came here from Nigeria with nothing. They worked hard and played by the rules. My dad became a college professor at a public university, and he since has gone on to be with the Lord. But my mother is that prime beneficiary. We got to be beneficiaries of that hard work and that career. So if we lived in some state where they put all their energy and all their emphasis in ESG investing and these things failed, we wouldn't have those benefits, that the thing that my father worked hard for. And I realize that there are people all across this country who have that same kind of reality. My hope is this. We're seeing the writing on the wall. We know right now the Trump administration is not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. We have seen that the courts are starting to rule, in my opinion, rightly on ESG investing not being a fiduciary focus, and therefore you can't be able to do it. So what I would hope is that these blue states, and quite frankly, some of these red state pensions, and I can talk about why that's happening as well, but a lot of these pensions, I hope they see the writing on the wall and they get completely out of ESG investing. They focus on fiduciary duty, getting the best possible returns because their constituents and the American people deserve it.
Well, yeah, and so that it makes me think about, one thing we've talked about before, which is knowing where in each state the sort of levers of policy are in order to make sure that these kind of sound guidelines are in place. Because we know every state, that's the glory of our federalist system, sometimes infuriating federal systems. We got 50 states, we got 50 state constitutions.
Right.
A lot of them are modeled, of course, on the federal constitution, but they're all a little bit different. So in some states, the governors have certain powers. Um, the treasurer has certain powers. In some
Mhm.
cases, the people who sit on certain important boards are appointed, or someone is elected, so they are an ex officio member of the board automatically. And it's not always obvious to someone outside any particular state who actually is the person responsible for making the decisions for all of these kind of individual, financial management decisions. They're big decisions, ultimately with billions of dollars, like you said. You put together the assets managed by all of the SFOF's members. We're now in trillions of dollars. Um, so but it's kind of opaque because in in the past, it feels like without all of these kind of like ESG adjacent politicized issues, things kind of ran kind of on autopilot for a long time, and it wasn't that controversial. So no one ran for statewide office saying, I'm going to like be the best possible vice chair of the state equalization board, right? No one knew what that was because it wasn't something, people were
Right.
concerned about. So how do you, as someone who's kind of like coordinating efforts with people from so many different states, how do you deal with the fact that one treasurer in one state may actually not have the same powers and responsibilities as someone in another state?
Well, there are a few different ways, and you mentioned people used to not run on this. They are running on this now. The North Carolina Treasurer, Brad Briner, he ran on this issue. There is a unique power within that treasurer's office to be the sole fiduciary. And he said, look, if you make me your treasurer, I'm going to focus on fiduciary duty. I'm going to focus on financial returns that are best for the people in my state. And he won. We had the same focus with the treasurer in Oklahoma, Todd Russ. This was a major focus of his, and he's doing well. And he has been off to a great start in his first couple of years in his office as state treasurer. The state auditor in Kentucky, she was the state treasurer, Allison Ball, and did this throughout her time as treasurer, ran on the issue of making sure to focus on transparency on these types of matters. She won her election. So people are running on this now, and they're doing an exceptional job and they're winning elections. The way that you can really capitalize on this is, again, from a few different perspectives. First, there is the collective power of the State Financial Officers Foundation. One of the things that our financial officers do is they work together to co-sign a letter. And that letter could go to members of the federal government, it could go to the business community, it could go to proxy advisors to say, look, based on our perspective, managing these assets on a regular basis, sitting on the boards that manage these assets on a regular basis, we think this particular behavior is wrong and you should change it. And we've been able to see some significant movement as a result in the behavior of asset managers all across the country and the world, quite frankly, because of some of these efforts. You've seen initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, NAMSI, or however some folks may pronounce it. That initiative, that was a global one led by BlackRock, has now crumbled as a result of some of the actions that our financial officers have done. And so it's that kind of thing that when you band together, you can make some significant change to really reorient and shape the behavior of markets in a positive way that benefits the people. That's one thing. The second thing, again, is what we're trying to do with the State Financial Officers Foundation through the Public Fiduciary Network. And the Public Fiduciary Network is exactly the way that it sounds. It's people who sit on public pension and public fund boards where they have a fiduciary responsibility. It could be in a red state like Texas. It could be in a blue state like California. It doesn't matter where you are, you sit on the board. Our interest is to get you the education, the information, and the statutory background you need to ask important questions. Here's our state law. Are we actually responding in a fiduciary manner based on what the state law says and how we are investing these dollars? And then so on, asking the different levels within the pension system. So it could be the pension executives themselves, the pension consultants, the proxy advisors that you hire, the asset managers, anybody in between. Our interest is to make sure our financial officers and other public fiduciaries are as educated as possible so they can make better decisions. So it's the individual work, providing the education from our perspective, the collective action of our financial officers, and running on these issues so that when you win, it's clear you've got a mandate from the people.
Well, yeah, and so that gets into sort of again even more kind of inside baseball issue here, which is that some of these, I think, when you say like there's a say a state treasurer's office, and people sort of imagine that there's a number of people sitting around in an office and they are sort of reading the reports and making the sort of like relevant investment decisions. If you know making investment decisions is part of that state treasurer's job, but of course, just like with the federal government, there's a lot of contracting. There's a lot of contractors that come in, and so people will say, "Well, we need specialized expertise, so we're going to go out and hire
Mhm.
an asset management company or a proxy advisor firm or whoever to give us sort of various advice." And and so this, I mean, this is sort of callback to something you kind of like hinted at before, which is there's even in states with uh, what we would consider fairly good governance
Mhm.
that have made some financial management decisions that seem a little confusing in the past. And the question is like, well, this is a red state. Why do they have all these like left wing priorities that are sort of infiltrating their state investments? And it's because someone decided to hire BlackRock, and then
That's right.
it's no longer like a Republican elected official who's managing your state finances. It's now BlackRock managing your state finances. So maybe it shouldn't be surprising that that sort of stuff happened in states where you would think, well, the predominant political culture of that state really isn't aligned with that decision. So what's the deal?
Yeah, the challenge is this. A lot of the asset managers, the proxy advisors, the pension consultants, the people that were contracted to have a fiduciary duty on behalf of their pension boards became ideologically captured. These are now folks that listen to the left. They believe in leftist policies. They support climate change, social engineering, and things that regular Americans have said no to. Our responsibility at the State Financial Officers Foundation is to equip our financial officers with the information that says you can ask specific questions, explicit questions of these folks within the pension industrial complex and say, you need to do the job that I hired you to do. You need to make sure that you are focusing on fiduciary duty, the best possible financial returns, and the best financial benefits for our members of law enforcement, for our teachers, because we need to make sure that our pensions that our people have earned are the best possible. And if they don't do those things, then our financial officers should feel confident and compelled to fire them.
Here, here. So, you mentioned that some of this sort of activism and policy work at the state level has gotten real results, and that both the U.S. and even all around the world, there's sort of this sort of ripple effect with financial firms. Um, you know, how do you push back on bad ideas without sort of overreaching? I think as a state official is a certain question because there's a lot of debate in the past few years about whether decisions, by some state governments, again, sort of Texas was really well out there in 2021, places like West Virginia and Utah, they had uh, state legislatures voted to end financial relationships between the state government and firms that they thought had bad, sort of mostly ESG aligned policies. In Texas, they said, look, if you're going to boycott oil and gas investing, then the state government's not going to do business with you because that's kind of important to employment in our state. Um, and then, but then some sort of critics come in from the side and say, oh, well, that's now you're politicizing it, right? Now you're doing sort of ESG from the right wing versus the left wing version, and that's just as bad. And if you fire the people you were hiring before, and then you have to hire someone else, maybe you'll pay higher, fees, and that's bad for taxpayers. Um, but when I think about this, I think about the the state officials and the state legislatures, they have a sort of, holistic view of this, which is what is best for our state,
Mhm.
right? Which might be different than if you were sort of like a management consultant and you came in and said, "Oh, well, BlackRock says they can manage your stuff for 1 basis point cheaper, so go with BlackRock," even though there's values that are not aligned. So, could you talk about that, the sort of um, kind of the sort of bloodless accounting version, which is, of course, this is all about finance. So we care about money and finance, but the sort of wider political leadership view of it, which is that we want big picture, long term aligned values with what our state government is doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that if BlackRock charges us $1 less, that we should automatically go with them.
Well, Richard, what you're saying and how I would respond to this is that it is important that we understand that people aren't widgets. People are part of communities. People make up a nation. A nation has a culture. A nation is a place. A nation is a people. That's one of the things that's been so resounding and refreshing with the Trump administration. And again, this is the benefit that a lot of our financial officers have been pushing since they've been in their jobs. Culture matters for each of the states that they represent. It is important that we value federalism. As you pointed out, West Virginia is a different state than Kentucky, which is a different state than Texas. Each of the interests matter. When you have a state legislature that says oil and gas is our top product, it's our top export, it creates thousands, if not millions of jobs that benefit and serve the economic interest of our state. It is incredibly important that you do not employ businesses that seek to undermine and reduce the output of oil and natural gas. And that's what net zero is. It's the belief that you should reduce carbon emissions, which means you should reduce fossil fuels by 2050. Well, that's gas, that's oil, that's coal. So if your state relies on quite heavily the production of gas or oil or coal, then you shouldn't be in business with asset managers and with funds and financial institutions that want to reduce all of those things. The same thing is true with beef production. When people talk about carbon emissions and methane, they're talking about cows as well. Again, this isn't my just made up language. This is what, again, these different Climate Action 100 and these different groups who are like that say we want to reduce beef consumption. Well, if you are in a state that relies on cattle or the production of beef as a livelihood and to sell, and you have significant farms or you export those goods and services, then you don't want to be in business with a financial institution or a financial manager that wants to reduce beef consumption. So when states pass legislation, they're not doing it to say, well, we want to now do right-leaning ESG. They're saying, look, just get back to neutral, get
Mhm.
politics out of it entirely. And explicitly, these things you're doing directly harm and undermine the interests of our state, which is why Texas passed the legislation that they did. West Virginia passed a legislation that they did, Kentucky and so many others, because they have a responsibility to protect the interests and the people of the state they represent, which is the same thing now that I think we're going to see at the federal level with President Trump protecting the interests of the nation.
Well, yeah, and so that's a good pivot because I'm sort of thinking about pulling back here for a minute and looking at the big picture of the past several years. And starting with COVID in the spring of 2020, and then we went into like the protests and all the unrest in the summer of 2020, and since then, this sort of the whole kind of now like Biden era. We've had, I feel like we've been in this sort of kind of distinctive phase in American political history where, for lack of a better term, we had woke politics were really sort of ascendant and we're at the uh, top of the zeitgeist, if you will, leading the zeitgeist, if you will. And now, post 2024, uh, it feels like we're in the middle of kind of a reset.
Mhm.
A lot of stuff has changed. Like you mentioned, the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance was one little data point. All of those big banks, all those big financial firms who joined that and said we're going to net zero. We're all in the climate activism train. Almost all of them have left to the point where that particular alliance now is sort of like not even around anymore. Um, and that and that's happened. All those firms have streamed out over the past few months, even just few weeks, and I think that's part of like one little example of this kind of reset I'm seeing, and so and it to me it even seems as sort of kind of a armchair student of American history. It even almost seems like the era of radical politics, right, between 1968 and 1972, right? A lot of like, the summer of 1968 was kind of crazy, and then kind of the radical politics that followed on for next few years after that were pretty wild in American political history. But then starting in the early 70s, things started changing, right? And by Richard Nixon landslide election, and then at from that era of everything being radical and crazy, we had the Reagan Revolution 8 years later. So, what do you think about? I guess that's my sort of my theory. But what do you think about there being kind of a vibe shift here with after 2024, and maybe we've kind of left some of those that kind of left wing activist energy has kind of like spent itself out.
I think you're seeing this across the board, and President Trump mentioned it in the very first statement of his inaugural address. America's golden age begins now. I believe, Richard, we have left an age of grievance, and we are now entering an age of meritocracy across the board. If it's ESG investing, where you take away regular investing, which is a focus on financial benefits, and you move towards your politics, that's no longer going to be the case. We want you to be the best at what you do, and then we're going to invest in that to get the best possible returns. The same thing with DEI, this belief in equity that because of a perceived grievance, you should be given a job or you should be given a seat on a board as opposed to your merit, as opposed to skill and ability. Those days are over. So now, with regard to whether or not you should get an opportunity for something, it's can you earn it? This is a focus on meritocracy. Again, with the immigration system, you look across the board at what President Trump has done. The focus is now on can you earn your citizenship the right way? This is now an age of meritocracy where, again, in the American tradition, if you work hard, if you play by the rules, then you can achieve anything you want to in this country. And I believe in this personally because my family has lived it. As I mentioned before, my parents came with nothing, but because of that, they worked hard. They were able to buy a house, put three kids through college, and now their favorite, as I like to say, their baby boy, is to be sitting here in front of you today, leading the State Financial Officers Foundation, talking about the importance of excellence and merit and intelligence. And my kids, God willing, will be able to do the same thing. This is the American dream. This is the American way. We have left the age of grievance and we have entered an age of meritocracy. And we can thank President Trump for it. And we can thank the state financial officers across the country for leading the way.
All right, OJ, excellent. That's an inspiring wrap up. Well,
Great.
so thank you very much for being with us. But before we go, can you just remind people where they can find SFOF and all of your great resources?
Yes, you can find SFOF at sfof.com. We would love to have your support. We love for you to focus on our financial officers and the great work that they are doing. And again, Richard, it's been a pleasure to be on with you today.
All right, thanks again.
Thank you.